Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I am joined by Aoife Bairéad. So I'm so excited that you took the time, Aoife. Thanks for doing it. How are you?
Very well. I'm very excited too. Thank you.
That's great. So Aoife, if you can just begin by telling you a little bit about yourself, that would be super, please, about your background and your work and all that, please.
Of course. So I'm a social worker, an independent social worker, which is quite unusual in Ireland anyway. It's more common elsewhere. So I do, and all of my work pretty much is focused around attachment and trauma work with children and families. So I do quite a few assessments for court report, for children in care, and I do some therapeutic work for children in care or children who have been adopted. And I then do some support and supervision for staff and teams, and training for UCD and the Irish Association of Social Workers and different groups. But yeah, I suppose the independent piece means I do all the bits I'm interested in, and it's really lucky like that. And I've been working with children and families for 20 years this year.
Wow, okay.
My anniversary in April. So I kind of started when I left school. I had no plans to be a social worker. I liked babysitting. That was about as much as my interest in kids went, and I was good at it. But no, I worked in films when I first left. I wouldn't have got a very good, I didn't get a leaving basically. But so I was working in films, but as part of that, I decided to take myself off to volunteer in Vietnam for a few months.
Wow.
I was that young white middle-class person going off to work with poor children in another country. That was me. Yeah. But I ended up staying there for nearly 3 years, running an art and music project there, which was amazing. Still, yeah, no, it was absolutely brilliant. So some children who were with their families whose parents would have been very poor, and other social issues that went with that, and some children in care as well. So when I came back from that, I had no interest in working in films anymore. And I worked in residential with teenagers.
Okay.
And quite quickly realized that I needed to get some kind of education if I wanted to move up, all of those things. It wasn't as stringent as it is now then, but you still need something to kind of, and I'd already kind of, I wouldn't have called it a systemic approach, but I was already frustrated by only working with the child. I kind of, any chance I got to work with parents or with teachers or other professionals, I really, but mainly families, I really enjoyed that. And I kind of got frustrated by how in residential I didn't get to. So social work I kind of saw as the option for that. I went to Trinity and I had a really great time there, but because I didn't see myself as academic, I wasn't particularly looking forward to it. And I remember kind of going, what are they, the arrogance of me. But anyway, I was wondering, what are they going to teach me? And my very clever team leader at the time, Lorraine Ryan, who's still very clever, said, it's not that they'll teach you how to be with people, they will teach you why what you do works.
Yeah.
And that's gone through my head so many times now that I teach, because I think particularly with the trauma-informed work and relationship-based work, it's really intuitive.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to people, I see them nodding all the time, and it's like, they know this. They didn't know they knew it, or that's not how they would have phrased it or whatever, but they did know it. So her very wise words have stuck with me ever since. But yeah, no, so I remember being in college and doing attachment theory and thinking like, oh, this is it. And being really excited about coming out of college and being able to use it. And the kids I'd worked with were so different. The kids in Vietnam who were very smiley, very friendly, very well behaved, and very hard to get close to.
Okay.
And rightly so. They knew by virtue of me being there, as a white Irish person coming, I wasn't going to stay. So actually, they were completely in the right in terms of their strategies, but I hadn't really realised that. And then not all, but quite a few of the boys, the teenage boys, would have used that ambivalent, angry 1 minute, charming the next, apologetic for apologies, and that back and forth that you would see with those dynamics. But yeah, so when I came out, and I was so excited to kind of apply these theories, yeah, I became quite disillusioned. Attachment was used as another problem that was within a child or in a child, something as if it was intrinsic to them. And I certainly wasn't by any means an expert, but what had really resonated with me was that you were attached to somebody. Sorry, excuse me. So I kind of, it just didn't fit with what I had thought I knew. So, and people, so there was certain professionals doing attachment assessments, and I didn't see anything hugely different in what they were. Again, it was this kind of thing in the child. So quite quickly after I qualified, I ended up going over to the UK. I think it was in a year of qualifying, to learn how to do attachment assessments.
Oh, right, okay.
And they were ones that I knew could be used in court as well. Again, when I started in my degree, I don't think I expected to end up in child protection, but that was where I did, and actually I suit it well. I like using assessment skills. I like that kind of systemic approach, and I'm good at forming relationships with families, and that's the trickiest part of social work is how do you assess while supporting, and generally I think I do that well. So yeah, I was doing that for a few years. They're all attachment assessments because you have different relationships at different ages. They're broken down by age. So it was taking me a while to kind of get through them. But in the meantime, I also became a team leader. And in children care, children have child and care reviews about every 6 months or every year. So you look at all the areas of the child's life. And so there's about 100, anything between 120 and 130 children who would have been allocated to the 4 or 5 social workers I was managing. And I was really struck by the amount of developmental difficulties that were being presented by those children. Okay. So, gross and fine motor skills, speech and language difficulties, global developmental delay, OT needs, physio needs, cognitive difficulties, social difficulties, emotional and behavioural. And it was within, because I would have done maybe 1 or 2 a week, going quite quickly to different people above me saying, like, this is quite striking. I hate the word normative population, but compared to what you would see day to day or what primary care may have referred to them or the HSC, we're up 50, 60, 70% of the children on my caseload anyway. And when I asked around, most people seem to feel it was about the same, like that. They are staggering. Wow.
They're
numbers.
Staggering.
And sometimes higher again, I'm sure. And nobody seemed to have an answer again. And I was really, again, that kind of, I don't know, like, again, an acknowledgement it was there, but not sure why. And a knowledge that it was probably because of what had happened, but not why, or,
right.
There was that joined up thinking, I suppose. And so then I ended up kind of going down that path and learning about developmental trauma, and therapy and DDP, kind of giving more the higher levels of that, giving more insight into what you would do about that, I suppose, or how you might support people in that or children in that. That was kind of.
Sorry, the DDP, that's Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy.
Psychotherapy, right? Yeah. And often, I think almost everybody now, if you do therapy, you'll do one level of DDP and vice versa, because they kind of, DDP is probably for slightly older children, therapy for younger, but they would go hand in hand. They were developed separately, but are now together. Okay. So I suppose that was it. And then I would have absolutely loved to do what I do in Tusla. I'm sure that'll come up at some point, but I'm not sure you can do this work without becoming somewhat political about different things. And the idea that people should have these services as services available to them is something that's really important to me. But my job doesn't exist in Tusla at the moment. Right. I hope it will in the future. So I ended up going out as an independent social worker, which, as I said, there are lots of perks too. I get to decide what work I like and when I want to do it and how I want to do it. And if somebody rings me and says, do you want to teach this? I have a think, and they're like, yeah, I would. I'd enjoy that. Or do you want to support this group or this organization? Like, yes or no. But that freedom has been great. And I've just my job is really interesting. Like, I'm incredibly lucky. I'm never bored. I think I've done most jobs for about 4 or 5 years, and it'll be 4 years this year doing this. And I still feel like I'm kind of at the beginning of so many things. You know, it feels really, I'm always learning and it's always changing. And it's brilliant.
Well, it's an exciting time. And I know you originally from Twitter, where I've mentioned on this show before that I've met many great people and learned an awful lot of things from the people I've encountered there. And then you participated in an online event that I put on last year. There seems to be more and more support across different sectors, and indeed just ordinary members of the public, people who've survived trauma and attachment problems who are interested in this. But can I take you back briefly to talk a bit more about attachment, because not everyone maybe knows what it is, and it's something that affects absolutely all of us. You know, we all have a style. We were all babies once. So why is it important, and what impact can it have on us as we get older?
Yeah, so the way I would see it, and this is a very Irish example, so you're going to have to adapt it for your culture, but I'm pretty sure it's largely universal. So at an Irish funeral before these times, they're usually very big. A lot of people talking to the family and checking in, and you would often see somebody in the family, a son or daughter of the person who died, for example, at the front of the church, shaking hands with everybody, checking in on everybody, making sure you have a lift to the graveyard or to the pub afterwards or wherever it is, asking after your mother, and very, that kind of looking after other people, very kind of together. And sometimes with an awareness, where they might say, you say, you okay? Or like, oh, don't hug me, I'll start crying, or I'm just trying to hold it together, don't ask me if I'm okay. So it's not that they're not aware that they're doing this, but it's kind of, it doesn't fit with the grief you might expect. And, you see the kind of busyness in them the whole day. So that's your avoidant attachment. You're avoiding what's going on and pushing it down so that you can get on with things, because you feel you have to keep going. That's essentially it. And equally, at the same funeral, you could have somebody inside who is extremely overwhelmed, not wanting to leave the body, for example, saying, I can't leave him or her, or I don't want to go. And again, saying, I don't know why I can't stop crying. I can't seem to stop doing this, so aware that this is a different kind of way of being for them, but not really able to control it. And sometimes it can be extreme, people feeling they can't even get to the funeral, that they turn off so much that they can't even get themselves up or out of bed, or they need a lot of support to get up and out of bed. And equally, the odd time you will see the anger that comes through of that as well, and fights and arguments at funerals or afterwards. And so that's your ambivalent. It's that kind of push-pull, I need people here. No, get away from me. No, I need you, and again, most families I know who've lost somebody would recognize themselves and the people around them in those dynamics. And that's all it is. It's like in a moment of danger, we've lost somebody, you have coping mechanisms that allow you to kind of get through it as best you can. Now, most of us within a week or two of losing the person will have returned to generally normal. Not, you don't feel the grief or loss, but those things aren't quite as overpowering. The difficulty is that for some people where the danger was pervasive early or is pervasive today, is that they get stuck in those ways of being, and they behave like that even when there isn't an evident danger there. So you've kids who are in school going, everything's fine, everything, good as gold, teacher's helper, very compliant, never says a word, all of those, not necessarily very academic, but very good. Golden, good as gold. Because the danger at home, whatever is so frightening, is so pervasive that they carry it with them into other relationships. Or you have the kids where the danger at home is sometimes people show up, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're scary, sometimes they're fine, but that unpredictability means that child needs to kind of feel that they're always here in your mind, for fear that if they drop from your mind, they're forgotten. Like, it's usually a loneliness that goes with those children. And so from the teacher's point of view, they're very demanding, and they can be very, they would always talk about the behavioral. Those children will always be noticed, I suppose. But equally, they would also often talk about how sweet they are and how cute they are. And, if they're helping, it's actually really nice. And that's what I say to them. Like, it's literally is any attention will do. If it's helping with the milk, lovely.
Yeah.
If it's throwing a pen at your head, lovely. Like, as long as I'm here, lovely. I'm being slightly facetious, but for the kid, they're just like, am I here? 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 Because the danger is too great, as I said. So even though that teacher hasn't caused that danger, or the foster carer, or the youth worker, the child's carrying that knowledge of that danger with them, so they get stuck. And if that doesn't get sorted out, that stuckness remains in adulthood, or may get sorted out, and then something happens in adulthood and it comes back. So that for me is the how I kind of see it or understand it in the world.
Thanks, Aoife. And are those patterns then laid down at a very, very early stage? Like, is it normally in the context of our relationship with our birth mom or whoever our main carer is?
Yeah, so I suppose there are loads of reasons, because I do some therapeutic work with kids who haven't experienced kind of the more obvious traumas that you'd work with from children in care. But there's loads of reasons why parents can't be available to their children in the way they would like to be, being long-term medical intervention at the beginning. And that is what should happen. That is absolutely the right thing to happen. From the baby's point of view, though, they miss that the 24/7 responsiveness that their older or younger brother or sister would have had, because they didn't have those interventions, and there's an impact from that. So, and of course, kind of the more pervasive that is, and the longer it takes to sort out, and again, in families where there is danger, and like genuine danger in the family, rather than through medical or outside the family, then those things become kind of more set in stone. So I suppose the way I think about it is that most parents aren't perfect. We all just muddle along and try and be good enough, which means that most kids have a bias. So when things go wrong, they'll go towards good as gold, or they'll go towards push-pull, or pull in. But then they'll come back again. And the more extreme it is, the less wiggle room they have in that. Do you know? But yeah, I think most of us have a bias anyway. But yeah, no, it's early. And a lot of the evidence would say if you get a good relationship early, even if dangers happen later on, you can recover more quickly. Whereas if the first relationships are difficult, it's much harder to get those good relationships later on. Not that it's impossible, but it's that bit harder to do. So the more we focus on those first 2 to 3 years with families and make those as safe for the parents as possible, so they can be as safe parents to their children as possible, the better we all will be.
And you mentioned adoption there. Of course, Ireland has a long history of female oppression and mother and baby homes and the like, where, the consequences for getting pregnant out of wedlock were fierce, which I think probably meant highly stressed pregnancies. And then, babies were taken. Does that cause a kind of primal wound, Aoife, for the baby? And can it have repercussions down the line, even if everything else was, really good and safe?
Really good, yeah. And I think that's really hard for some adopted children, is that feeling of always feeling othered or different, or that they're, not as together as their brothers and sisters, or they're not as strong, or all of these things. So yeah, so there's definitely, there's increasing evidence that epigenetic factors are there for mental health and drug use and vulnerability to PTSD and other and the physical conditions as well, of course, which is why those rights to people's records are so important for both of those reasons. But so there's those factors do seem to be there. And then stress in pregnancy does, that the higher levels of cortisol do seem to result in babies who are born with higher levels of cortisol. Drug and alcohol in pregnancy, either because a parent doesn't know or they're unable to stop, does seem to also have impacts on babies when they're born. I suppose for me, what I always think is we call it wired for stress, so you're kind of born in that way. if somebody is born and very quickly goes into a really calm, loving environment where all of that, because parents can be stressed in pregnancy for lots of reasons and good reasons again,
Yeah.
and sometimes, parents can carry anxiety then, like, I have to not be stressed because I have to not harm my baby, and then the stress goes up. You're like, self-fulfilling prophecy. And even, thinking about, families in the Ukraine today, that, there's reasons why people would be chronically stressed for long periods. The difficulty with things like the mother and baby homes here, and even in terms of children coming into care at birth here, and in other countries, is that you rarely get into that immediate, secure space. Children in care today would, for many good reasons, but they would, most babies when they go home are with one caregiver who is there, in Ireland, who is there 24/7 for at least the first few months. Often, we hope, with good family and community around them supporting them, not all the time, but often that is the way. Children who come into care are, with a foster family, or with a foster mother or father, but not 24/7, because they have to see their birth parents as well. So these children are going from one relationship to another. Babies don't know who anybody is, essentially. They know the smell and the touch and the responses of the person they feel safest with, and which and no disrespect to birth parents, has to be the foster care, because they're with them most of the time. And so for them, it's just this constant withdrawal of the primary attachment figure, and it's interrupted. Mother and baby homes, to an even greater extreme. There's, people have told lots of stories about that, of only having their baby with them for an hour, or only for feeding times, and then left in cots for long periods of time. Even if that was brief, from a baby's point of view, the only way to stay safe is to stay close to your primary caregiver. We're entirely reliant on others until we can walk, and then very reliant for the first 4 to 5 years. Do you know? So, so in terms of the danger signals going off in the brain, and that, so you're wired for stress already, and then the world you come into is stressful, and the baby's ready for it. Like, I get a bit annoyed at kind of the deficit approach that's sometimes taken to these symptoms, because actually learning that, crying too loud results in an adverse reaction, so you learn not to cry so loud, or learning that a little whimper doesn't work here, I have to roar to get my needs met. Our babies getting the absolute best of the parents or carers they have. That's what they got.
What a great point.
Incredibly adaptive little beings. Humans are so adaptive, and they get the best of the parent that they got. And I just think that's incredible. And sometimes when it's spoken about around adoption and fostering, it's as if there was some loss or failures. Now, of course, we don't want children to be born into stress and have that reactivity, that reactivated all of the time. But if that's the truth of their lives, and they have ways to manage that, that's pretty incredible, actually.
Indeed.
And sometimes that's the healing piece, is helping people work out, oh, this isn't because I'm different from my brothers and sisters, or I'm the odd one out. Actually, that was really incredible that I learned how to be that way, or to do it that way. And little kids can have really, really special reactions to that. It can seem really awful, something about drug use and pregnancy, or abandonment, or whatever. And actually, their retelling of their own stories, with the bits that they pull that make sense to them, are gorgeous in many ways, because they just are like, oh, that's why I'm me. It's lovely.
But isn't that right there now about the power of information, that even though you're very small, if your brain and survival responses maybe are explained to you in words that you can understand, then your withdrawal or your fight responses, your explosions, your pushing people away, or your shutting down makes sense, and you're not broken then, or it has a function. It has a really useful function given what you've experienced.
And that whenever you feel scared, your brain kind of goes into autopilot. It's like, I'll do that, because sometimes, I'm sure you've had that, where you're with people and they're like, oh my God, I'm back here again. I'm doing it again. I'm back in my old patterns again. And I'm always like, okay, that's like, breathing or sweating for the rest, this is just what we do. What's the danger? We really have to work out what the danger is, because something's happened. And there's a really nice quote from Terry Pratchett you know, which is probably 20 years old or something, but it's always struck me. I'll say it badly, but it's something like, coming back to where you started is not the same as never having left.
Nice. Yeah.
So I talk to them a lot about that. I'm like, okay, so we are back here again. But what do we know from the last time? What have we learned? What do we know works? How do we get back to where you want to be quicker? You know, what are the patterns that we know bring you to safety? Those kind of things are really important.
Yeah, indeed. It's a lovely quote and relevant to many of us, you know, because trauma is a common thing. And certainly, as you were talking about patterns, there'd be certain patterns that I have that I understand are not the best, you know, and with all my awareness, does that mean I don't fall into them sometimes? No, it doesn't, because they can be hard to break. And I suppose the earlier we learn them as well, the harder to get rid of them entirely when we're unsafe for whatever reason.
Some of them are really, like, you know, people can be a bit, you know, that kind of having your own history and what it might mean. And for me anyway, like, I'm really good in a crisis. You know, I remember going into a residential and then be like, Aoife, plates could be flying over your head. And you'd still be like, do you want to just come in here today? You know, I will keep calm.
Wow.
Like, that was learned in a certain space and place. But that's really good. It's only if I do that all of the time, every time, if I'm always going to be there in the crisis and I'm going to be the calm person, that's dangerous. But that serves me so well. In so many places, and I really appreciate it, because it means when other people are really overwhelmed, which happens a lot in my work, obviously, I very rarely panic. Afterwards, I'll suddenly go, Jesus Christ, what was that? But in the moment, I'm generally quite good, you know, and that's a real gift, you know, to be able to do that with people. And I really appreciate it myself. But I think for a while, I just was like, oh, that's just how I am, rather than wondering why I was like that. And also didn't mind my own recovery. And I now am really good when something like that happens. I mind myself in my recovery from it and let myself process. Because actually I'm usually not okay. But I really genuinely feel okay in the moment. I don't generally feel panicked until afterwards.
Yeah, it kind of keeps you safe and the other people safe, or at least it's not an explosive situation. I can see definitely how that's very handy to have someone steady through this kind of storm. Yeah.
And it's a real, like, you know, that's an Irish dad thing, but I think one of the reasons loads of Irish dads ended up being unhappy in many ways is they had to be like that for everyone all of the time. And you have to, for me, it's about then, when I stop feeling okay, my recovery is the important bit, my own recovery, and recognizing that that's just, mine is just a bit delayed. From other people, my panic system is just a bit delayed. But I think, like, I mean, all of it is useful somewhere. And I suppose that comes from working with people. Everything is useful somewhere. Everything has a function somewhere. Everything protects us somewhere. There's no bad strategies. It's when we're stuck or we have no flexibility in our strategies that things get tricky. But all of them are helpful somewhere.
Yes.
And valuable somewhere.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, because people often probably view themselves with shame and anger that they keep repeating certain things, or, you know, even use of drugs and alcohol to survive. I mean, it does help people survive sometimes. Grossly difficult circumstances. So there is, as you say, always a function in whatever the seemingly maladaptive behavior is. It starts as an attempt at a solution.
And the amount of people I've spoken to is like, if I didn't take drugs, I would have killed myself because I was in too much pain. And I often take that approach with teenagers, you know, if they do start doing stupid things. Like, I mean, it's their job, but some are more stupid than others. Some decisions are more stupid than others. The teenagers are all very bright. They know what they're up to. But sometimes, like, when they do start, particularly the kind of the good as gold ones, I'm like, do you know what? I'm delighted. I'm so delighted you finally tried to do something about your pain. Because we thought you were in pain for ages. You kept on telling us you were fine. But we genuinely thought you must be. That must have been really hard. So I really am glad you found something. There's definitely downsides to the one you've chosen, and we might need to talk about that. But I'm so happy you've actually finally gone, I need something. Because going along the way you were, I was worried, you know, you might explode or just all get too much one day or whatever, because so much is going on and you keep on saying you're fine.
Yeah.
I don't expect parents in foster care as my own child. I'm not saying I would talk like that.
I know,
but
no,
do.
I get you. I get
Yeah.
you. The kind of restoring as well, and the seeing something as that there are benefits to whatever it is.
Has to be.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the adverse childhood experience evidence base? Does it, in your view, have implications for relational health and frontline practice, including social workers and other professionals as well, like psychologists and lawyers, maybe even?
Yeah, so like, I mean, the biggest thing is that the protector to those factors is your one good adult or your one good relationship. And, you know, there's a lovely Bruce Perry quote, which I won't say because it's too long, but it's basically saying, like, when the danger happens within the relationship, the healing has to happen within a relationship too. And I really hold that to be true, and not always that you feel it in the moment. I've had teenagers come back 10 years later with a, you know, found me on Facebook or, you know, email or something and gone, I just wanted to let you know, I really appreciated that, or that was really helpful. Or I remember you telling me this.
Lovely.
And, you know, at the time, I kind of knew it was something, but I wasn't going to do it then. But now I'm doing it or whatever. And like, I mean, there's not loads, but the odd one. And it's really nice when they do. So we can all, you know, be that person who makes somebody feel that in that moment, particularly for kids who've grown up in scary spaces and places. You know, until there's a discrepancy to your experience, you probably won't wonder about your experience. And it's only when a teacher or a youth worker or an auntie or somebody makes you feel different from the way you do at home that you go, oh God, maybe there's a different way. There's another option. And that discrepancy is often where the healing is, or the wondering of themselves, you know, that they may start talking or telling people or whatever. So I think it's massive for that. I worry sometimes about people kind of using the checklist approach to anything. You know, it's a kind of, it's a shortcut to much more. But where I have found it helpful is sometimes where people just feel so unlucky, where they're like, how did I manage to have this history and now these problems, physical and mental? Like, how did that happen? And so to, again, that psychoeducation piece to say, well, did you know this data is out there? That this is absolutely the obvious outcome, actually, from where you came. And so it's not some weakness on your part. This is what happens when we don't mind people and we don't get to keep them safe. You end up being physically or mentally unwell. And back to that thing of, you know, that we know these things. You know, I remember growing up, I grew up in the inner city. There would have been a lot of drugs and other issues there. But I remember mums and grannies and granddads and stuff in our area talking about people being sick. It was like, but she would have had a hard life now, or things would have been tough on her. There was actually an acknowledgement that stress made you sick, I suppose. And I often think of that, like where they would have been like, you know, when somebody died young, it was like, she didn't have an easy life though, you know, and it was real. They knew, you know, we know what we know, kind of, you know, you have this data, but actually people have always kind of known.
It's common sense in a way, I think. If all these awful things happen in childhood, and then they often happen as well in adulthood, sadly, for people, that it's the accumulation. How could it not have a harmful effect?
Exactly. And there was a real kind of, that was a given to a lot of people, you know, around me growing up. Or even people using drugs and alcohol. It's like, she doesn't have it easy. Do you know, like it was, you know, there was a lot of kind of, there was some very judgmental stuff. There's a lot of forgiveness about it and kind of understanding of it and empathy to it as well. And I suppose what I noticed now, like there was a report, time has become irrelevant, but I think it was about a year or two ago, of the mental and physical health of people in chaotic homeless services. And it was almost identical to what you would see in the ACEs. So it was like, this isn't even about childhood. This is if people are persistently in danger and not able to keep themselves, you know, either the basics, safe, warm, comfortable, fed, then they get ill. They get physically ill or they get mentally unwell. But that's what happens when we don't mind people. So again, back to this kind of, I don't know how you do this without becoming political, but it's the same. Direct provision centres would see high rates of, you know, physical and mental unwellness. Prisons populations, you know, so all of these spaces where people aren't being minded, they end up with, you know, even if their childhood was relatively okay, other things have happened since and now they're not okay. So I'm not sure, I don't have the data the way, like the ACEs study is so huge, you know, whatever it was, 17,000 the first time, and it must be up to well over 100,000 now of that data being collated. But I think if you applied it to any population that was endangered, you'd see that a number of years later.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, I suppose the limitation with the original study was it was only 10 types of adversity, but then there are things like poverty and being a refugee.
Community ACEs, I think, are really prevalent. And again, I think sometimes that, you know, in terms of people trying to understand why me or why am I, or, you know, so if you say like the people in addiction and drug use, so a huge number of them, the numbers vary, but it's well over 60% most of the time have experienced some trauma. But some of them haven't, and the same in prison populations and mental health populations. So you have, you know, the vast majority who have this thing that kind of makes sense, and then you have a small number who are like, well, that's not me, so why, you know, the vulnerability or that, you know, and that kind of guilt of it, like, well, how did I end up like that, or what happened to me, you know, that I chose this path. And so I think both the community ACEs is really helpful, but also that's to me often where attachment comes in. So I'm like, so your life wasn't theirs, but there is vulnerability here, you know, even something like you know, medical issues, or two parents who were very busy, a parent who had lost a parent very quickly after your birth, all of these things that, you know, despite your parents being lovely, loving, caring, these things happened that left you with this vulnerability. So you already had your bias, you were a bit more, you know, going to move into that bias quicker than others anyway. And then these other bad things happen, like bullying or losing a partner, losing a child, any of those things. You know, not being able to find work, doing badly in education, any of the things that make us feel rotten about ourselves. And then your bias was already there. So then you're kind of pushing further into that. So it doesn't have to be trauma. It can just be, you know, these small, you know, wearing away at your kind of coping mechanisms and your value of yourself and your self-worth and all of those things that you end up in these same spaces. But I really feel sorry for people when they get into that, like, well, what's my excuse nearly, and feeling that guilt that goes with it. It's really unhelpful. But yeah, particularly community ACEs, and then, as I said, those other stressors make sense to me within that.
Can you tell me a bit, Aoife, about the relational dimension of your court work, please? And can court cases themselves be sites for traumatic reenactment? You know, where the unsafety, say in the family home, then gets played out somehow in court.
Absolutely. The most obvious ones are where there's domestic violence or coercive control, or those spaces where the legal system, because it's adversarial and based on evidence, not always the weight that you would give in a criminal trial, but you still have to present evidence, that can be used, because barristers and lawyers and solicitors aren't trained. I think it's coming in, but they aren't trained thus far in this. So you have people, again, who intuitively know it and behave in a certain way, and people who definitely intuitively don't. And so, so there's those cases. And then in childcare cases, so children coming into care, that would be where my views came true so strongly, because I would have felt like that. I would have felt I could have held the kind of support and assessment piece really well with lots of families up to a certain point. And then it would be very much dependent on the, I suppose, often the legal team, and this isn't to blame them because they're not trained, as I said, you can't know what you don't know, but legal teams who would take a certain approach, and suddenly parents who you'd kind of gone, look, this can't happen anymore, kids aren't okay, but here's the plan and here's what we're going to do. And then suddenly it was like these nitpicking arguments over, like, you know, is this going to be every 2 days or 3 days? Is this going to happen now? And getting very personal meant that parents who are already quick to go into fight, flight or freeze were very quickly pushed into that space by people who don't have those experiences, and so don't really get how quickly people can move into those spaces and stay in those spaces, and sometimes talk as if they're being reasonable, But because I knew them for so long, I was looking at them going like, she won't be here by the time we get to, like, if this keeps going, she's going to leave before the case is heard, or we're going to be into a big fight and we're going to be here all day, or, you know, whatever the responses were, because, you know the person. And sometimes I'd be saying to them, I'm like, okay, just hold on, this just, you know, trying to, but you're in a difficult situation because you're like being pitched on these two different sides. And the people who lose are the kids and the parents. Like, the worst thing that will happen to me in court is that a child will go home or will be in an unsafe situation.
Sure.
And that's awful, like, I mean, and the worry or whatever, but essentially I don't hold responsibility for that. You give your best and you do your best and all the rest, but there will be guilt and shame attached with that. I never have to experience the truth of that. You know, I have the professional piece. I never have to experience the actual, you know, if that harm does take place or if that danger does take place. So I'm always one step removed. And then other than that, it's, I suppose, you know, sisters and barristers of different ways, but some are quite belittling. So my ego might be bruised, but, you know, it's not my family. It's not life or death. So we can kind of, you might get worn down over time. I certainly don't relish going into court in any way, but it's tolerable. The implications for families, like, I mean, it can change how they, you know, whether they get to be together in the long term, the type of relationship they'll have in the long term, whether those children will be positive about their parents in the long term. All of these things can change in that space because it's not understood that scared people are reactive. And it's really, I just find it really frustrating, but I just find it really, ultimately really sad. Because parents love their kids and very, very few want to harm their children. There is, of course, the odd one, but, like, I mean, thankfully in my career, almost unheard of. Lots of parents have their own trauma, have their own difficulties, have their community ACEs, you know, there's poverty or there's domestic violence or there's gun and gang violence, you know, all of those things outside the home, you know, and so it really isn't actually on them. You do have to protect the child, and you know, that decision is a horrible one, but you always have to make it. And I often say to parents, you know, if this assessment was written for you, I would be giving a different set of recommendations. These are often the wrong recommendations for you. I just think they're the right ones for your child. Now, I would like in the course of my work that those two will eventually meet again, but right now they're different. And you know, that it's important to acknowledge that having your child not with you is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a parent. And for some children, remaining at home is the most dangerous thing that will happen for them. So, you know, you're holding those two truths there. But yeah, that if you can come, you know, if we could work in the way that some other jurisdictions have, where you come together, you say, well, look, this is the child's in the middle and these are the priorities, but here's how we will all work together around those and make those, you know, the best outcome for this family overall. Even if the child doesn't go home, like sometimes people are saying, well, they can't all go home. I know they can't all go home. But actually the best outcome for this family, given that reality, may still be that you do lots of work in those visits that most children in care have visits with their parents every week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever is decided. You could either choose to let those kind of float along, or else you could really work on that so that the children have a really positive psychological sense of who they are compared, you know, in terms of their family. And actually children who have that do better in care than children who don't. So there's you know, good evidence as to why we should be doing that for every case as well. But that all gets mixed up and turned upside down, because like a really obvious one is, I would go in and do an assessment. I would say, I think this parent needs this type of psychotherapeutic support and this kind of family support. Now, their barrister's job is to undermine everything I say so that the order isn't made. In that process, a parent who I could have a good relationship with comes back to me and says, well, my barrister says, you know, you're only a social worker, you're not a psychologist, or your training is in England, it's not for here, or whatever they've been told is the argument that the barrister has tried to use. And so then the bit that would have actually protected that parent, which is this type therapeutic approach, is then dismissed because the parent's like, I don't have to do that, or I don't want to do that because you're no good at your job. Do you know, and it's most professionals going in are of the view that, you know, I'm probably stronger on that than, you know, in terms of that systemic approach and that social work approach, is that I often have recommendations for everybody. And I assess everybody, foster carers, children and parents all get fairly equal treatment in my assessments. But there would be a lot of good, I think, for a lot of parents, and I genuinely mean that in terms of for themselves, but actually for the relationship with their children, if you could follow through this. And some cases, legal teams can make that, they will fight and fight and fight for that parent to get absolutely everything I and others have recommended, and to work and work and work and to hold Tusla to account so that relationship becomes as strong as it possibly can. And you see really good outcomes. And otherwise, the fractiousness of it and the argumentativeness of it means that all of those communications break down, and then nobody ends up with the things that would benefit them. Or if they do, it takes a really long time. And as I said, that's nobody's fault because they aren't trained and don't know,
Yeah, but I mean, I've a legal background, I'm not a qualified lawyer, but I know people who describe the kind of operation of the law as a game and want to win.
So these social and cultural things that they have, which I don't. And I've had, people rip me apart and then come out and go, oh, nothing personal. And I'm like I blood, sweat and tears to do what I do. And it means so much to me. And it is very much, a part of who I am. It isn't just a job. So actually quite personal.
Yeah.
Or I know this kid for 2 years and I have to see them and how they react, actually quite personal. So I get that.
High. And like you get that the stakes are high, whereas they move on to the next case, and might have a scoreboard of how many cases they've won versus that type of mentality.
Yeah. And they would be better in, say, criminal proceedings or, white collar crime. I wish they'd all go to white collar, even criminal. I wish there would be more humanity. So actually, let's just go white collar.
Yeah, white collar crime, or maybe corporate law or something,
that kind of thing. Yeah. But they will do far less harm there. So no, but what I mean is, I think if they knew, not all of them, I think many of them, if they got the stakes and they really understand, they would change. And I've seen people change. Some of those solicitors I've known and barristers I've seen over like 15 years or something now, and some of them really have changed. And they do get it. Yeah. So it's not, as I said, I do think, and some of them have said it was from listening to somebody's evidence or seeing something work that they suddenly were like, oh. So I absolutely, everyone can change, thankfully, the hopefulness of our job. But yeah, no, there's definitely a culture there of winning, and that means, and if only one person wins, then everyone loses in family law is basically my piece.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, important point. Do you think then that we need widespread training for lawyers and judges if they're dealing with traumatized individuals, which in my view would certainly be in the family courts, but also the criminal courts?
Yeah, no, I think it's across the board because, look, hurt people, that kind of understanding is there no matter what court you're in, and as flippant as it was, probably even white collar crime. But that there is, so I think that is important. But I do think as well the system as it stands makes it very difficult to not be adversarial, because people, you have to provide a certain weight of evidence. And actually, I think that's right. And this is where this comes to pretty much everything I do. I think about, or when I'm doing anything, it's like two things can be true, 3 things can be true, 5 things. You can have a parent who abuses you, who loves you, who made you feel good and made you feel bad, who when you went to visit you wanted to see, but when you saw them the fear came up. All of these things can all be true at the same time, and it's the black and whiteness that we get into trouble with. It is, I think, true that to remove a child from a parent's care should need a weight of evidence that somebody has to prove. That is right. Social workers should have to abide by a certain level of proof, evidence, and that all other things have been tried before you make such a huge decision, because it does have lifelong implications for both parents and children. So that is true. And to do that, there's going to be some shaming involved, because you have to say what you think a parent has done, and that is shameful. And being in a public, it's not public in that it's in camera, but there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in the room sometimes, so it is somewhat public shaming, and parents, of course, become defensive, right? And I've seen parents have every response. Some parents disassociate, some parents argue, some parents, just won't go in at all. Some parents are on their phones, kind of listening, or some are frantically taking notes. Everyone has different responses, but all of them, I think, are in response to that, self-protectiveness. So I think it's not that we don't have to provide the evidence, but it's how we do it is important to me. And how we do it at the minute is shaming, and it gets into this adversarial. So the person who is most likely to actually try and get you where you want to be. Most parents, even if they can't have their children back, want to see them as much as possible in as natural as possible a way. The more they go into the more extreme defensive responses, the less likely they are to be able to work kind of well with the social worker. The more the social worker gets into these defensive responses, the less likely they are to be open and let's try and do new things. And I've been that soldier. Like I'm ashamed of some of the, like, how narrow I got sometimes with parents. I was like, no, this is just because I was so stressed about going into court and going back, and look, this is what was agreed in court. We can't talk about it. I'm like, what was I doing? But it was that I have to go back in 28 days, go through this whole thing again, prove all these things again, be questioned as to my authenticity or my capability or whatever. It's, social workers get worn out by it. Yes. Parents get worn out by it. And I'm not sure how it gets resolved. So I think, being able to provide the evidence, but in a way that isn't, that there's smaller steps, I suppose, is how I would envisage it. And more careful, more nuanced ways of communicating it, so that by the time it gets to the judge, there's a certain amount of information that everybody knows, and the judge can be confident that everybody knows, without having to go through a 20-page report every time.
Just on the stress and kind of turmoil really for social workers, I imagine, from everything I've read in the media, and I chatted with Bernard Gloucester from Tusla and Hayley McNabb, it is a fraught career path. And I think the stakes are high as well for individual social workers. If we just think about some of the cases where children have not been taken into care, and later on it's been found out that horrendous abuse and neglect and sexual abuse and things have happened. I imagine that must be quite tough for especially younger, maybe inexperienced social workers going into courts and having the kind of sharks of lawyers coming at them, and just like your own nervous system must occasionally be in a state of defense, I imagine, because it would be perfectly normal.
And again, like, probably because of what we spoke about, like, I'm kind of calm in a crisis. I'm good in court. I can, I usually give my evidence well. Sometimes I get frazzled, but most of the time I'm grand. But there is an impact afterwards, particularly, as I said, if so either, it's gone so divisive that nobody's getting what they want and everything's gone wrong, or, as I said, something really awful has happened, that you're really worried about that child going home or not getting a service they need or whatever. Or something continuing for them that's definitely not okay. So like, social workers, I think, are generally fairly upfront and honest about that. It is not the part of the job most people relish. Some people do, again, they like the assessment piece, or they enjoy that kind of piece of being able to, when they can do it, that you manage a kind of a relationship while having this assessment piece at the same time. Like, there's a lot of skill to that. There's a joke about social workers, jack of all trades and master of none, but actually the multiple skills you need is, I think, one of the things I really value about the job. I will never I'll never have a narrow skill set. It's always dynamic. So there's parts to it that people, I suppose, aren't necessarily opposed to, but it is just that pervasiveness of kind of, first of all, the social worker who has the case and is in the stand is ultimately held responsible, at least by the court. Now, that's not the truth. Truth is Tusla does, but the way it's treated, obviously, in the case is that. And so you have the lowest grade, which is basic social work, taking on like the highest level of responsibility nearly. Do you know what I mean? In that, once you're a team leader, you don't get in the stand, your social workers do. Now you support them and you help them. Once you're a principal social worker, you only go to court if things go really wrong, so. So in terms of your skill and your experience, actually, the higher you go, the less likely you are to be in that situation. And that is, the social worker with the relationship with the child should be the person on the stand. So that's not to say that's the right thing to do, but just the stress that's on them. But I think one of the main things most people speak about, again, is the damage it does to the relationships with the family. Sure. Like most people, that's the thing. They don't like the day in court, and again, your ego might get bruised, or something that you really want for a child may not happen, or something you worry about may continue happening. But ultimately, I think most people, the thing they find really stressful is what happens with the relationship, because they would have often known those families for 2 or 3 years. Before they get in there. Like sometimes you get in there quickly, but often because families don't, particularly with things like mental health or drug use, or even the kind of the borderline cognitive, where there's poverty and those, like, people go up and down like the rest of us. You have good weeks and bad weeks, good months and bad months. Something else happens, the family things are going good enough, and then they come down and things really aren't. And so you could have been up and down with them 3 or 4 times before you go, okay, this pattern is too frequent now, or we haven't come out of that pattern, or the things that worked before aren't working anymore. But they really care about those parents, and they really care about those children. And sometimes grannies and granddads and older brothers and sisters who've you could have a really really involved across whole family systems, and then suddenly you're in this situation where people won't talk to you, they're really angry, and rightly, they should be angry. If people are trying to take their children from them, absolutely, I get it. But for the social worker, it's like trying to hold that. So yeah, I think it causes a lot of overwhelm for people, because nobody gets into the job wanting to remove children from their family. I don't know anyone. They want to get in because of relationships, and they want children have the best lives they can, and spend time with children. Again, the kind of the move across all areas of health service provision and mental health provision is, it's becoming increasingly bureaucratic and time sensitive and all of that. And for social workers, we can't do a good job unless you have those relationships. Every HICWA report I've seen in the last couple of years has talked how families who get on with their social workers feel like they get a better service, and a fairer service, and a more dynamic service, and one that actually helps. And the biggest stressor for families and foster carers is when they don't have a social worker, or they're not consistent.
Yeah, that strikes me as very important, from having read articles and occasionally heard people with care experience talk. The relationship with the social worker sometimes there's too much chopping and changing. Of course, many social workers are women, and they might have absences due to pregnancy, and then there can be, or they move jobs or move counties or whatever. But do you think for good outcomes for children or young people in care, that maximizing like continuity within a caring relationship with the social worker makes a difference?
Absolutely. And they've told us that, I think, for at least 20 years. And I can't even, in terms of my job satisfaction, yes. But far more importantly, kids who are in care are saying, like, this is what we need. And this is really, really undermines our experience when we don't have this, or no social worker chopping and changing, or being given a social worker who they don't get on with. Nobody gets on with everybody. Nobody gets on with everyone they work, or everyone in their family, or anything. And the idea that a kid or a parent could say, do you know what, like, obviously you could be onto your 6th social worker, and they'd be like, okay, hold up a minute. But the fact that you might have a clash with somebody, I'm like, oh, that's normal. Like, it's so weird that you'd be like, actually, particularly if they've had a really good social worker before that they really connected with. Sorry, the other social worker might be really good as well. But if that connection isn't there, I just think kids in care have a right to go, at least if, once or twice, do you know what, not for me. I'd really like somebody else. And it's not that people in Tusla, I think, would be resistant, but the resources are just so thin on the ground. Like, I think, again, the stats are somewhere, but do we have, half of what they have in the Northern Ireland or something like that? And anyway, we're one of the lowest in Europe per head of population. I do know that. And it's really, it affects everybody, but the main thing, again, it affects their children and families, because the most good that will come from a social worker intervention is when the social worker has the time and family have time to trust them. And the least good is everything happening in a crisis, which again is part of the job, and is often, there's no way to avoid it, but sometimes you could avoid it if we had enough people. And social workers really feel that kind of, Like if you're caught up in court, for example, everything, the court reports need to be evidence-based, so you're getting dates and times and all, there's a lot of work that goes into just writing the report. If you're doing one on top of the other, then you're like, I wonder when I'll actually see the child I'm talking about. This is going to take 3 days of work and I've got 5 cases in court. And they might have 17 or 20 kids in their caseload. Do you know what I mean? Like, just and every social worker I know does overtime, builds up time in lieu. There's a reason why so often social workers leave. As you said, high turnover. It's really intense. So as I said, some of this is resources and training more social workers, and then some of it is, once children are in care, the things that are available to, as well as a social worker in Tusla, that Tusla needs to grow and change, I think, in terms of what's offered to children once they are there.
Can Tusla be trauma-informed or responsive the way it is now? Like, is it possible with what you've just described with the resources? Because it sounds like to me it actually couldn't, because it's also kind of in survival mode.
But I suppose, like, if you were to go pure trauma-informed, pretty much nobody can be, because trauma-informed means that you're dynamic and holistic. So that means that not only do you have to be that, but every service you work with has to be like that as well. So that, whenever somebody says to me, I'm trauma-informed, I'm like, well, maybe on your own, but that's not your client's experience, because unless every service you work with is as well, then that's not it, or say that, we are a trauma-informed service. I'm like, well, your service might be, but your client most people in Ireland don't get a trauma-informed service because they have to deal with more than one service. So to be fair to Tusla, even if they put all the work in, it would have to be the HSE, Department of Justice, Department of Education audit as well, because that would be the child's trauma-informed and family's trauma-informed experience then. But putting that aside, the difficulty is that now there is plans, as far as I'm aware, to build therapeutic teams within each area, and some of them are already doing that. There's trial ones going on. You're not, if you come into care, so you can only come into care if you're at risk of harm or you have been harmed. And then leaving your family, no matter what the good reasons may be or the right reasons may be, is traumatic. And again, think about people in the Ukraine today. There are families splitting up today who know why they're doing it, but it is hugely traumatic that they're doing it. And it is self-protective. They're doing the most protective thing in that circumstance. That doesn't, just because doesn't remove the trauma of those families being separated. And the same for children in care. Just because there's going to be more harm done if they stay, the trauma of losing their primary carers is still there. And you're not guaranteed any therapeutic intervention when you come into care. It just has always astounded me. Like, I really struggle with it. I just think it's really, particularly for the kids who do the good as gold, I think it's really hard, because they aren't going to be noticed as much as the ones who are, jumping from the rooftops, who are making sure they're seen. But even for those kids, if the only thing that's available on your team is play therapy or an OT or art therapy, that's going to suit some kids, but like everything, it's not going to suit all kids. Again, what children need is going to be different things at different times. Now, I would say, I'm sure Tusla feel, well, we know that's what you think, because my therapeutic plans sometimes look like they're going for years, because I'd be like, well, now they need to do the sensory regulations, that's going to be an OT for now, and then you're going to have to look at the attachments, that's going to be theraplay or filial therapy or Marty Mao. In a few years they're probably going to need like a narrative therapy, because they're going to have to sort all this stuff. And then when they're a teenager, you're probably going to have to get a one-to-one therapist, because even though this impact of, say, sexual abuse has been dealt with, that as a teenager that's going to need another level of understanding. So maybe have something waiting in the wings. But essentially I think that is what children probably need, at least available to them, whether they use it or not, to recover, because it's multi-systems, within their body and their mind that have been impacted. And as they grow, that'll have different meanings and will need more sorting out in their own head and sorting out relationships. And alongside that, I said, I may have therapeutic support for the foster carers or for the parents, saying this is happening with the parents' relationship, but this is, so, but yeah, they're systemic. So that's just the way I think. But no, essentially, I do think, saying, well, this is the service that we have available. It'll only work for a certain amount of kids. Now, that's really great if you're that kid, but not if you're not. So yeah, I just think and the outcomes, the reason I take it so seriously is the outcomes for children who've been in care are, again, worse than children who haven't. Like we have some pretty shocking statistics over the last 15, 20 years. And not everybody, of course. And some young people just, they're astounding and they do really well. But a lot of them would say, that's because I always knew my mom loved me, or I always had this with my uncle, or my foster carers were amazing, or so they'll tell you the reasons it worked for them. I had the same social worker for 15 years. They usually have a really clear the knowledge themselves why their life got to be different.
Yeah, and it usually a strong relational reason.
Always.
Yeah. It's almost hard for me to imagine how there wouldn't be a relational dimension to being able to thrive in the face of adversity there. And
that's that's what foster carers give is, that's what I said, it's literally brain surgery. You have a kid who might go in who can't speak or can't walk, can't talk, can't feed themselves, soiling, wetting, can't sit down, can't go to school without make it through the day. And in remarkable time, sometimes 6 weeks, 6 months, they've caught up. It's just the most astounding thing to watch.
It's very special.
I don't think foster carers realised, because they're just getting on with it day by day. But again, that idea of good enough really is good enough. Being able to just be there every day and offer it. And foster carers can be exhausted. I always say to them, look, this is like having a newborn. I know he's 8, but or they're 8 and 6. Think about having 2 newborns. It's that intense for the first few weeks and months. But the outcomes, not that it solves everything, but it solves an awful lot.
Yeah.
So we have to be minding them as well. That's why I don't have recommendations for them, because you're only, you can't give what you don't get.
Yeah.
So if the foster carers aren't feeling safe and supported and that they are understood and what they're doing is understood, then the kid can't get that. Now, often foster carers don't need professional, they've good communities and supports around them. But sometimes the kids that, literally land in their homes and in their hearts, it's beyond what anybody else can support or understand. They do need that extra level. I'm sure some of the cases that have been in the paper will come to mind, where you hear of children with just the most extraordinary symptoms and difficulties, and foster carers get up every morning and do it again. And I'm absolutely in awe of them.
Yeah, they really are performing a remarkable public service that I think most people don't think about from one day to the next until there is a scandal, or something bad happens. But I am very thankful for the work that they do. I think it is very, very special. Just a couple more, because I'm conscious of your time and I've really enjoyed our conversation, Aoife. Thomas O'Driscoll, who is a man who was in care himself in his youth, was recently quoted in an Examiner article to mark Care Day, and he was calling for a root and branch reform of the care system. Would you agree that the system needs considerable reform and overhaul?
Yes. Legally, organisationally. But I would say again, it doesn't matter what I say. Thomas and others have been through it, and their opinion is the one that counts. I can stand on the sidelines and I would absolutely support it, and nothing he or others have said has struck me as anything other than remarkably sensible. But they lived it. The rest of us can have all the views we want. They're the ones saying this has to happen for me and others, and that's the important thing. So yeah, and there's a multitude of ways. I think it should, but and they would be specific around trauma and attachment and relationships and family dynamics and all of those things. But actually, if they're going to do it, they need to hire people with those experiences and have them oversee it. There has to be, it's an expertise role. And they have that expertise through some of the most painful and horrible experiences. But they're standing there today saying, we can help, we know. And I think, I find it really difficult in those circumstances where they have people there as a kind of a voluntary consultation. We'll go and talk to you.
Yes.
That would have happened with some of the mother and baby home, and the laundry pieces, that it was, they gave their time to it. Yeah. But then there was the people at the top. If this is to be done well, then people like Thomas and others should be at the top.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, well, that in and of itself is such a trauma-informed principle that, people who've lived through it are leading, or at least really informing it, and not, as you say, just in a box ticking kind of, we've consulted with them or we've done a few surveys.
Can't be a consultation. No, they have to be overseeing it. So I feel really strongly about that. And parents, I mean, kids are absolutely, but it's really good. They're looking now at doing a parent advocacy piece, but parents who are going through this, so they can have the relationship with the social worker, but social worker will be clear, my role is to the child and should be, and you're important to the child, so you're important to me, but they will like that. I'll make a decision for them rather than you. They may have their solicitors, but the way the court is, they turn up on a day, they see their solicitor that day, and they may not see them for the next 28 days. They may not hear from them. So they have all that time wondering, and, they might be going to meetings and being, told what's what. But unless there's a cognitive difficulty or something like that, they don't get an advocate. And it really worries me for people who are so vulnerable. And as I said, they and their children will benefit the healthier and more kind of psychologically able they come through this process. So having parent advocacy there is really important, but also having their voices of what didn't work throughout. And again, that's to me where it's not just Tusla, the Department of Justice, the HSE, parents needing very serious mental health or drug support and not getting it, people being homeless while trying to get their children back. There's these things that are just too big for any one person. So I think their voices, again, in that overseeing role is really important.
Very last question, Aoife. What can politicians and policymakers do to promote safe, healthy relationships in childhood and indeed across the life course? You suggest they're a multi-agency approach. Is that one of the things that we need to start
Definitely with? And again, I think, back to that reason why I ended up doing social work, I think I'm just somebody who thinks systemically, and I think I have that kind of join the dots kind of jigsaw way of looking at things. So there's a bias there, certainly, but I just don't see how we can offer people what they need unless we, so there's somebody asked me I can't even remember, a while ago anyway, what good enough parenting was. It's the phrase we often use, Winnicott's good enough parenting. And they're like, well, what does that actually mean? I was like, having to think about it. I was like, I think what it means is that you have the capacity and the resources to sort out most of the problems that happen to you and your family relatively easily. Not without pain and not without suffering and not without things going wrong, but you can get there. And if you take somebody's resources away, their capacity is diminished. If somebody is going to spend their whole day trying to get a bed for the night, then the time that they would play with their child, rest with their child, feed their child gets eaten away. And, listening, some parents who are in homeless services, manage to do that really well. But again, would often talk about, the children will go to family or they'd have somebody else to lean on, or it's good after school service, that it usually does involve relationships that they get to do it. And even then, so many parents of children in homelessness talk about the fear they have of how their child is being impacted by it.
Sure.
And that often is their driving force to get out far more than their protectiveness of themselves. Same with parents whose children have high levels of disability, neurodivergence, those kind of things. So they're like, I know what they need, but I can't do it. So again, because we take away people's resources or we don't give them enough resources, their capacity is reduced. And that then, that comes with judgment from certain sectors, they didn't do this and they can't do this and their child does this and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh my God, if we step back and look, wide lens this, where did we think they were going to do it exactly? The pressure we put on people, and that is again, parents of children, I've suggested or said to the course that they should have come into care. And that's what I've said to them, like, I don't think this is your fault. I can see, I just can't fix those problems. And it's not okay for him to stay here in this way. That I can't do that because this isn't okay. But do I think it's okay that this happened to you either? No, absolutely not.
It's lovely that you say that, I think, because it strikes me as unusual, and probably shouldn't be, that there would be that kind of a communication, but it's kind and it's also truthful.
But like, if you don't have a really, holistic, understanding, family orientated drug service, for example, when are you going to come up with your drugs? It's just, it's baffling to me. And then, like, if you haven't got enough money, and yes, we can blame drugs, but look, we don't have, again, I'm like, if drugs were legal,
yes,
and we had a really good, harm reduction service, this wouldn't be a problem. So yeah, your money is reduced, so then you're stressed about that, and then the electricity goes, and haven't got the lunches for the kids, and then you're more stressed, so you take more drugs. And I'm like, it's all, again, these systems implode on each other with the worst outcomes for everybody. So yeah, like, I mean, do I want to fix it all? Yes. Do I think I will? No. But I do think that there's an element of kind of, so if our good enough has to be that we as a country or politicians, that we have both the capacity to at least see, what has to be done, and then, give ourselves the resources to do it. Because until we do, people are still going to end up just, falling through those cracks, or having the moments where things really do go badly for them. I would equally, I'm a realist. There will always be children where child protection services are needed. Sure. But it doesn't have to be as broad as it does now. And it doesn't have to be as traumatic for everybody as it is now. There are other ways to do it. Kindness is probably a good word. But yeah, that there's that the systems work together around it, rather than, at the moment, is it trauma or is it actually mental health? CAMHS would be wondering, do we take them or not? And essentially, then where's the child going to get the service? And that's because CAMHS is resource-led as well. That's not a criticism of them, but because we have services, they're always trying to say, well, who do we see next, and what the best referral I could take is. Then kids are essentially left, and families are left without what they need. That's a very long answer too. I'm not sure if it answers.
It makes sense. And just on the capacity and resource issue, I mean, we are spending fortunes on people. So our traumatized families and communities cost the taxpayer a lot of money in various ways, but we're not meeting their needs. So it seems our capacities need to be recalibrated.
Yes. And decide who we want to spend money on and how, because some of the systems in place at the moment support and resource other people. They de-resource and reduce the capacity of the families I work with, but other people are doing fantastically well out of it. So there's choices that are absolutely being made there, and priorities that are there. I'm sure, individual politicians really truly care, but as party systems, that gets lost along the way, for sure. And to the point of it being callous, sometimes I find decisions that are made.
And what do you think, I don't know if you have a view about the role of, say, civil servants? I'm asking this more and more because civil servants outlast politicians. They can be in a department for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, driving policy. Do people need to forge connections and relationships there more, do you think, Aoife? Or is it more concentrated on the political dimension, or both?
No, I think it's both, but I definitely think within the civil service, like, whenever I do training, people always comment, they're like, you have more questions than answers, because I would phrase stuff as questions all the time. And I'm like, but if you're in curiosity, then you're not in like an automatic mode, or, that responsive mode. You're wondering, and once you're wondering, then you have options. And I think some of that stuff with civil service, and having worked for Tusla and the HSE, some of it is, but we've always done it like this. Like, it's the most dangerous statement. So I think there's an element of like, not like HICWA come into Tusla to make sure they're doing their job. So not that kind of oversight, which again, it should be there. And there's, HICWA have raised some really serious and important issues, but that there's some way for any department to, like in social work, you'd call it critical analysis or critical social work. So you'd be trying to go, well, what have I missed, or having, and I suppose then what has to come from that, and that's the biggest, I suppose, the piece I've experienced from it is like you have to be okay to be wrong, and then you have to be okay to follow somebody else's view or point or whatever. I now love it. Like being humbled in my work and grounded in my work, I think is really important to me, and I kind of now go looking for it. I don't think I would have 15 years ago. The person who didn't know she should be a student or not, what she learned. So that has been a learning curve. I'm not saying everybody should automatically be like that, but there's such value in it. Like, I mean, I really appreciate it. I'm very rarely go into any space and go, I'm absolutely right and everyone needs to listen to me. Like, I really want to know what other people think and how they think and what they're bringing. And that curiosity is really there. I would love to see that. And again, not just because, oh, well, that's what I do, but actually it's made me so much better at what I do, and it's made outcomes for families so much better. And when I'm on teams where people work like that, you just see how things open up. I'm not sure government departments would love if like justice had health come in for an afternoon to see how they do things and not for their opinions and vice versa. But there's definitely I think that scope, if it was there, would be really helpful, because we can all do with another set of eyes and another view.
Right.
But even just bringing that kind of critical analysis to your own work, and not just do things because that's how it's always been done.
Indeed. Well, look, Aoife, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss why relationships matter and law and justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and my guest today was Aoife Bairéad. So thank you again, Aoife. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.